Joining us on the pod this week, a returning guest to help us get into what TV numbers mean and more, Nielsen Senior Vice President of Product Strategy, Brian Fuhrer. Brian, welcome back to the pod.
Austin, great to be back. Thanks for having me.
I thought it'd be a little helpful this time to start with something maybe a little more basic, something I for sure take for granted a lot when I'm talking to people, and I thought it could be good for listeners. And that's kind of like how Nielsen is doing the work that you're doing in 2025. How many Nielsen families are there out there? What does measurement kind of look like these days? I kind of want to start with that.
One of the great things, I should say, interesting thing about this business, it changes and expands every day. And I've been in here for almost 40 years, and it's a challenge because our clients are counting on us to do things that are going to reflect all of their audiences. And just a couple of things that we've been focused on over the past year. One is, you may have heard, we expanded our measurement to include big data, which is a really big accomplishment, and it moves beyond our panel to actually include a lot more capabilities and machine data that gets added on. And the second thing is just talking about our panel. We've got about 42,000 homes, over 100,000 people under measurement across the U.S. And in those homes, we measure everything about them. We know of course, their age and gender and all of that kind of information. We know race and ethnicity and a lot of information, not only about geography, but also just a lot of their basic characteristics. And it really helps our clients understand what their viewers look like and where their opportunities are.
You talk about the big data stuff, and this is something that I talk about with a lot of my sources, especially on the league property side. They're really bullish about what this could potentially bring to sports viewership. A lot of them think it could be a really big increase, kind of what they saw when out of home was first introduced. Obviously, there's kind of a lag right now, but once everything kind of gets solved by Nielsen and with the properties and with the networks, how do you think this can really improve sports viewership?
There's two things. One is, as viewing fragments. And one thing about sports, it represents the biggest events of the year, but it also represents a lot of fragmented viewership across local markets. And by including 75 million additional devices to kind of back up the panel, we're helping with the fragmented audiences that are viewing, maybe not the very top items, the largest viewed items across TV, but the more fragmented audiences. So it really helps fill in the blanks, if you will, and help understand the more fragmented audiences.
Well, Brian, the last time you and I spoke was just before the Paris Olympics. Obviously, a lot has happened, in the sports calendar and with you all. First, I kind of want to start with the Super Bowl. This was the first time that Tubi showed it. That's Fox's FAST channel. And you all had data that showed that it made up around a third of the audience for the big game. I'm not really a visitor to Tubi, hadn't really checked that much content there. But were you surprised that Tubi got as big of an audience as it did for the Super Bowl?
I wasn't as much, because as I look back, and let's rewind back to the Olympics, we're seeing these media companies that have multiple platforms. It's not just an experiment anymore. They're really starting to see big success. Most from a minute standpoint, when I look across sports events, across the past couple of years, the Olympics month was the most viewed, generated the most viewing minutes of any event. And then we moved into, what another tremendously impactful event, which was Christmas, and Netflix carrying the NFL games, ultimately kind of getting to the point of the multi-platform Super Bowl that included Tubi. And from a strategy perspective, it's really interesting to me to watch exactly what happens. Tubi made up a third of all streaming that day. Normally, they make up about 4%, just to give you an idea of the change. So there was a lot of people that probably had never even heard of Tubi before. Now we're using it to watch the Super Bowl. The audiences look different. As you said, they definitely had a significant contribution to the overall game. The audience was younger, and interesting to me, it was also slightly more female. I didn't see that one coming, but it was more heavily viewed there. And from the long-term perspective, you can bet that people that were in there sampling Tubi will come back. They weren't aware of it. Now, hey, it's a free service, and I think that kind of a strategy is going to continue. But these are real, tangible success stories across platforms.
I got to say, I did check out the library, after the Super Bowl, kind of saying, all right, well, what is actually on here? And it does have a very interesting mix of shows from the 70s, some stuff that I haven't maybe heard of from the 80s and 90s. But I was like, oh, like, I can't believe this is still around. It's obviously available for me. But I definitely would have taken the under there on what Tubi was able to get. And I think that was a huge win for Fox in getting over the hump to set another record.
As we're looking across this, goes beyond sports, but the fast channels, Tubi, Pluto, Roku, you talk about where they are now. Um, they've really expanded their libraries. If you rewind 3 years, even 2 years, a lot of remnant content. Now people are very surprised when they go out and they see what's out there, and it's free. So it's frictionless for people to try it.
And I'm sure sports content is helping. I know Roku has a number of sports properties there. So, yeah, like you said, add the libraries to the live sports, and they're building a strong audience. Another thing that Nielsen has added since the last time you and I talked is 100% coverage of out of home markets here in the US. Last year, and since you all had introduced, it was somewhere in the high 60% range. But that was another thing that I think that helped the Super Bowl set another record. How has this rollout been helping, not just what we saw at the Super Bowl, but for all of sports over these last 2 months or so?
There's a couple of interesting characteristics about sports. And when you think about top markets, we had about 2/3 of all markets covered with out of home measurement, but it was a top down situation. Sports doesn't always work that way because sports affinity can be even greater and more concentrated in smaller markets. So by including this additional third of the US, we also included markets that weren't previously measured that really helped from a sports perspective gather that more comprehensive audience. Luckily it was in time for the Super Bowl, and you definitely saw the impact to the overall out of home contribution.
Heck, I remember when we used to do overnights versus national data, you'd always see, or a lot of times you would see an uptick for a property like NASCAR going from the overnights to the finals because, yeah, you had some of those markets, those maybe smaller markets, but they were really heavily into motorsports, into NASCAR, and you would see NASCAR go up from the overnights to the nationals, which was the inverse of a lot of other properties.
It's lightning in a bottle. You never know what's going to really drive those audiences, and it's sometimes counterintuitive. And having those extra markets measured, I think, is strategically a really important enhancement.
I also wanted to hit on some of the new Nielsen Gauge data that you all dropped this week. That showed that YouTube had its best share of TV watching yet in February, approaching 12%, around 11.6% of all of television. That's around a point and a half higher than number 2, Disney. And now Disney encompasses, not just Disney, but Disney Plus, Hulu, ESPN, those channels, etc. So my question is, beyond YouTube TV, it feels like there's going to be a point where YouTube is a serious player potentially for leagues, teams, events down the road for live content. Because, if I understand the data, it's not just young folks that are hopping on YouTube these days. It's across the spectrum. Is YouTube going to be a strong player for sports, do you think, later on?
Well, I think YouTube is already a strong player for sports, but maybe not in the way you're thinking. YouTube is a great destination for people to put highlights up, and traditional media companies use it to promote games and great plays that are out there. The question you're getting at is, will they license original content? And that's certainly outside of my realm of knowledge, but I do think that there's a lot more sports viewing now on YouTube, but it's mainly people going to see, the great plays and the great highlights.
That's how I show my kids dunks from the 90s. They're like, oh, Vince Carter did what? I'm like, sit down. We're going to watch a collection of Vince Carter dunks from the 1990s. I need to show him dunking over Frederick Weiss at the 2000 Olympics. Yeah, you got to see that. Is it nails on a chalkboard at all for you and people at Nielsen when you see a network or a property, like combining Nielsen viewership with maybe audience P2 plus sort of data from other firms? I'm thinking about like when Adobe Analytics gets added to Nielsen. I know NBC, ESPN, Fox, they've kind of done things like that. The NHL takes Nielsen and they'll add numerous data that's from Canada when they're trying to show a complete North American picture. Like, is that kosher?
Our job is to work with our clients to give them the most complete measurement that we can. And what our aspiration is for them to always be able to really rely on Nielsen data across the board. And the reason that's really important is if people are trying to compare, and I realize everyone's experimenting and trying to understand where this growth is coming from, but when it comes to the end of the day and you're trying to compare across different entities, across different games, across different providers, That's why it's really important for Nielsen to cover all those so things are directly comparable. That's what we're trying to work with our clients on. And it's really a never ending battle because we're always trying to get the next invention that's out there. Engineers are always going to come up with new ways to distribute content, and consumers are always going to be searching for new ways to consume it. And that's what we're working towards.
All right, Brian, a couple more here. What's a sports property out there? It could be a legacy brand. It could be a newer sports property that's popped up that really kind of has surprised you with the numbers it's been able to deliver.
I've been looking at the different sports across the seasons and what's been changing and what's different. And for example, I've been looking at NBA basketball. When I compare basketball and Major League Baseball, there's kind of a trend in both directions. NBA basketball has gone from the big viewership was to the championships, where now the championships may be a little bit smaller, but they're expanding because of the volume of games they have across the season. Just the real estate across, different national properties are continuing to have, good viewership across the season. Baseball has gotten a little more local, and it seems like as you go through the season, the viewership might be, a little bit more spread out, but get to the World Series, and that's where you see this big balloon and a huge popular event. As I'm looking at this month, for example, it seems like Fox is really getting traction with NASCAR, and I kind of thought NASCAR might have hit a bit of a peak, but it's really come back, and particularly this month, it's in the top 10 sporting events, and made a difference for Fox in the media distributor gauge that you mentioned. They had a big jump this month, and NASCAR is one of the things that helped.
Obviously staying on a Sunday for the Daytona 500 was big, but yeah, it's even outside of that. It's the comparable races to start the season year over year. I think they have had a strong start, and a lot of NASCAR continues to still get lost with all this talk about Formula One and Drive to Survive over the last couple of years. And Formula One is a solid property, and I think it's interesting, but NASCAR races still double, triple, sometimes even 4x what a Formula One race is able to deliver on ESPN airways. Just a really strong property still.
I mentioned how sports can be lightning in a bottle. And last year's March Madness included Caitlin Clark, and that really drove some amazing audiences. Just most recently in February, kind of unexpectedly, the Four Nations hockey tournament was really, really popular and was the top rated show on cable. And those kind of things, they just capture the imagination of the viewer, and sports has the capacity to do that. And I think Four Nations was a great example.
Yep. Shout out to the NHL and the NHLPA for really nailing that one as an incredible TV property. Well, he's a returning champion after nailing Final Jeopardy on his last visit. A man with his finger on the pulse of modern viewership, Nielsen's Brian Fuhrer. Brian, really appreciate you coming on, man.
Always a pleasure, Austin. Thanks for having me.